we have uh, we have here to discuss this. I had shared a tentative kind of a structure and a brochure also with panelists, so I will not go through that per se here right now. But more than just very specifics on the program structure and so on. But to begin with, we thought we'll have a more general dialogue. We have with us, I'll start with the moderator, Professor Dr. S. Kriti, who is a professor in the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. She's a economist herself, and I should have had her in the panel, but I'm sure you will also give in your inputs. We have Dr. Alexander, who's from the Jindal School of JSIA, and and we have Dr. Rohit Jyotish, who is also from JSIA and an economist himself. We have two more economists online. One is Professor Kaustav Banerjee, who was supposed to be here offline but could not get a leave from the university. So he's here with us online. And he's been also engaging with questions of political economy for a long time, and is also on way to frame a program, a PhD program, in fact, to be offered in the university there. We have also Dr. Lorenza Monaco, who's right now probably from joining us from Brussels, but she has been here for a long time, for around 2 decades. We know each other, and she has worked on various questions to do with the industry, labor, and so on, and questions of political economy herself. We have also Dr. Rohini Sen from JGLS, who also has expertise in international law. And then we thought in the panel itself, it will be a good addition. So yeah, I mean, I'll hand over now to Kriti to begin. Thank you.
Hello. Mm. Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. We hope to have a very interesting discussion today on what would be the parameters of a course on international political economy, what would it involve, what are both the type of subjects, what type of courses should be included in it, what type of prospects we see in it, and the experience of teaching subjects which are to do with political economy. And I think also the request is to see how this is different from, say, a course on Masters on Development Studies. So that's what we are looking at as the objectives of this panel. Now, we'll go by the order in which we have the panelists as invited. So I hope, so we'll go with Dr. Rohit first. If anyone has a problem of timings or would like to go in first, please let us know. But otherwise, we'll go in the same order.
Thank you. I think what I'll try and do is maybe explain in terms of 3 or 4 points that I had in mind when Nayan first approached me with this idea that ideas is thinking of doing an MSc in international political economy. And I think I tried to buy some time from him because we ourselves at JSIA have been well, we introduced 2 courses within 2 of our undergraduate programs, which were both of them are titled Contemporary Political Economy. And the thought of teaching as an economist uh, initially towards political science students, now international affairs students, and then thinking of teaching political economy on its own, it during the course design process, I just had a lot of questions, and I thought those questions are quite useful for this panel also. So the first thought I had was the subject called international political economy really is a bit of a uh, in my blog, I would call it an avial, but most people here won't understand what that means. An avial is like a dish that is in the Kerala state here, which basically is a combination of various vegetables. And usually it's seen as an amalgam of whatever is left over during the course of a week of your kitchen's groceries. So, what I mean by that is that designing of political economy really varies depending on where you study it. So if you're doing an undergraduate course in political economy at, say, Brown University in the USA, it is very heavily oriented towards econometrics. And the focus is on causal inference a lot, which means that there is the paradigm of rational choice enters. That means that the focus is exclusively on institutions. So mostly around what Daron Acemoglu, James Robinson, all of them have been talking about for years. Uh, but if you make it international political economy, usually this comes under an international affairs school, which means that the topics will be something like financial statecraft, monetary hierarchy, global market power, uh, international economic law as governance, taxation and illicit financial flows, platform capitalism and digital regulation, and most recently, I think carbon capitalism, all of that. So, if you compare this with what the field was about, uh, maybe even 50 years ago, uh, 50 years ago, probably we were thinking in terms of paradigms. So this would be like one set of courses which will be institutionalist, another which will be uh, something around liberalism, another set which will be Marxism, and then a third set which will be realism. So you pick a side, or you, in order to be balanced, you try to have courses which spread along all of this. But today, I think a lot of the MSc or even BSc programs in IPE is designed around problem sets or puzzles. And it's about training students in being able to solve these puzzles. So then the second point comes, what should these problem sets or puzzles look like if you're designing an MSc in international political economy? So here there is an additional challenge which I also faced when I was teaching this in our program, which is bachelor's in global affairs and bachelor's in diplomacy and foreign policy. That would be, these problem sets are actually quite different if you teach it in the Atlantic as opposed to here in India or the global south. So uh, usually if you take a look at I don't know, the London School of Economics, their very famous program in IPE, it would have something like currency hierarchies, reserve currencies, uh, trade blocks, regionalism, sanctions and geoeconomics, all of those type of subjects. And then there will be these canonical puzzles which will be around the eurozone crisis, the WTO gridlock, US tech regulation. But then if we shift that epistemics to something which is global south, the puzzles actually change quite a bit. So instead of looking at MSc and IPE as a lot of topics that come from the global north with whatever is in the global south as case studies, we shift the epistemics to primarily the global south, in which case our puzzles become centered around de-dollarization and payment systems, BRICS finance and development banking, industrial policy under WTO constraints or whatever is left of the WTO, resource nationalism, South-South cartels, and actually middle power coalition politics. We could focus on all of these things. So this would be, in my opinion at least, a legitimate recentering of the field, uh, considering that this program is primarily based in India or a global South country. After this, we have to think of what kind of methodological focus do we need as part of this kind of a program. So this is where uh, we do a survey of what these programs offer elsewhere in the world. And you will see that, as I mentioned earlier, there's this heavy focus on quantitative causal inference style IPE, where you see power through measurable effects and you learn identification strategies and all of that. So that's one way of looking at it. And each methodological tradition can be seen as an epistemic formation. in which case, this is one, the quant one is one. The second would be historical political economy. That will be more looking at power through institutional trajectories and path dependence. And I think the document that Nayan you shared had a lot of the topics that you had covered in the document you shared was primarily in this tradition, historical political economy. The third would be legal institutional, in which case you're looking at power through rules, jurisdiction, enforcement, and enforcement asymmetries. Then, if you want a slightly more radical tinge in your course, you can look at it from the lens of feminist or approaches or social reproduction. So that will be looking at power through labor, care, and invisibilized work. But I think that kind of a course will be very different from what we would normally consider as IPE. But then you can ask the question, why is it different, right? Then digital, and everyone keeps talking about AI, and I think I don't know how much we want to focus on that, but uh, at least the digital world, or at least power as seen through infrastructure, platforms, standards, data governance should also be part of this kind of a design. So these aren't really all of these are actually very different approaches. And I think when I talked to you, Nayan, you had asked me about how would you design a curriculum around this. And to be honest, I don't know. I have been trying to do that in the contemporary political economy course. And I found it very difficult to develop a curriculum that uh, talks to each other or between these different kinds of epistemologies. And a lot of the time, I think we end up choosing one side, which is a problem. Uh, so the what I erred on the side of while designing my own courses was choosing problems, puzzles that interest me, puzzles that I feel, and in that sense, this is normative, puzzles that I feel are the most important, which is about power asymmetries in the world. And when you do that, a lot of these topics get covered. Uh, so then uh, you have to go back to those uh, epistemological starting points, which would be if you start from looking at IPE as global capitalism, usually what ends up happening is you look at North Atlantic capitalism, where development is a deviation. So that is a problem of this field emerging from America and Europe. But if you start instead from late industrialization, post colonial crisis, or post colonial states, informalization, and then development becomes constitutive of global capitalism, I think we'll have a very different course structure. That's what we can keep in mind, which means that will flip what we teach as core, what we treat as theory, and what we treat as case studies. Uh, Finally, one point I would add is the practical difficulties of administering a course like this in a private university in India, which is that IPE, if you want to stay true to the subject or the discipline, requires a long horizon training in understanding capitalism, institutions, and power. And if we, uh, in the search for some type of commercial viability of the course, if we limit ourselves to skill development, which happens quite a lot when we design courses, uh, the problem would be that a lot of the topics we cover become catchphrases or logos. So we should be very wary of that. And I hope that we are able to design a program which is self-evident in the sense that it is self-evidently valuable, that learning about power asymmetries of global capitalism is something that is worth learning, and you can target students who are interested in that. And that requires uh, a lot of the team members in ideas to be involved in the outreach, which I know is difficult. But I'm sorry to do this to you, but because I was part of this thing before, so I'm aware of how this works. The uh, but actually, when you design a program like this, to be fair to the admissions team, they're also overworked, and they won't be able to bring this nuance to the table. But for a master's program, given that compared to say a bachelor's program, the size of the class would be smaller, you can legitimately design some kind of outreach approach yourselves and then uh, give like a brochure of sorts to the admissions team. And I think you can legitimately try and do that, because that will also allow you to get the kind of students that you want, instead of getting students who will ask you, but what skills am I learning? I paid this much, what is the return on investment? You can avoid that by doing this. These are the broad points that I had in mind. Yeah.
Thank you, Rohit. I think that gives us an excellent start to the discussion. You've laid out the entire subject in the problems that we have set up, and we'll come back to many of these points in the discussions, believe. Also, we can have 10 to 15 minutes per speaker. You are very well in time as well. We can have 10 to 15 minutes per speaker, and then we'll have time for discussion. Thank you. Alexander, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Kriti, and thank you, Nayan, and thank you, Ideas, for organizing this. And I will try to structure my reflections the following way. First, I will talk about the foundations of political economy. And secondly, I will share my experience in teaching a very specifically designed political economy course, which I called critical political economy. And as I talk, I will also try to echo what my colleague Rahit has just said, because I think there are quite many synergies here. So first of all, foundations, international political economy. I think one way, first of all, when a course is designed in IP is problematize the name. Now, of course, international political economy, IP, is an established term, and it's highly institutionalized discipline. There are specific journals like Review of International Political Economy who are dedicated to the discipline. At the same time, maybe we can rethink the name itself, because I think the global developments, globalization, the rise of AI, global trade, of course, migration, and many, many others really, in a way, make the distinctions very fuzzy: national, global, local. And my preferred term actually for a program would be global political economy. And by the way, I think there is also a new journal with the same name. And, I encourage you to check it out. Now, of course, there's also comparative political economy, alternative, heterodox, and so on. But I think this is the first thing that needs to be considered. And also maybe as a marketing, in a way, tool, since this is a global university, this could be a program on global political economy. My second point, again, related to the foundations of political economy, is the idea that, and again, Rahit touched upon this, sometimes we have to choose sides, epistemological science, what is the world like, ontological stances. But I think the general point here is that there is no such thing as value-free science. There is no objective economics, and I mean to be provocative here on purpose. Let me also quote Joseph Schumpeter. One very succinct quote: "The way we see things can hardly be distinguished from the way we wish to see them." So how do we tackle this? For example, in my course, during the very first lectures, we make a distinction between 4 general approaches to political economy. Now, these are not theories. Theories are much more specific. But these are 4 broad approaches. And they, in turn, depend on values. For example, if we consider the classical kind of class antagonism, left versus right, political philosophers would call it politics of redistribution. Sociologists would call it, class conflicts, and so on. And then there is another one, what some call identity politics, liberal versus authoritarian. Again, sociologists would call it maybe group dynamics, political philosophies, politics of recognition, and so on. And if you consider these 4 distinct, in a way, poles, then we have 4 distinct perspectives: classical political economy, or neoclassical by extension. Then we have a radical response. Again, Rahit mentioned some Marxist theories. Then we have conservative political economy, or political philosophy, which underpins any political economic ideas. And lastly, maybe the most recent one is, some call it modern liberal, some call it Keynesian, social democratic. Again, from a political philosophical perspective, inspired by Rawlsian ideas and others. So these are four broad approaches. And within each approach, you can locate different theories. If you take a radical stance, we can talk about neo-Marxism, Gramscian, political economy, dependency theory, which I think is very relevant for the Global South curricula, and so on. If you are, in a liberal institution, maybe you would be more attracted to a modern liberal perspective, trying to humanize capitalism, find the middle path between efficiency, optimizing markets, making them competitive, and social protection, and so on. So my point to conclude this is that there are values everywhere. And even when you design a curriculum, you take a particular stance. So it's good to be aware of this. And it's good to make students aware that they choose a very particular stance. Now, related to that, and that also maybe could be helpful for the curriculum design, is dependent on these broad approaches, which I just broadly outlined, we have different implications for policies, right? Political economic proposals. For example, if we're talking about poverty and inequality, if you are radical, you would say that, we need some radical proposals, maybe nationalize the economy, reduce drastically the wealth gap, introduce universal basic income, and so on and so forth. Although UBI is a kind of, chameleon proposal, but still, if you are a liberal or modern liberal, you would say, well, we need to make markets more competitive, minimize the failures, invest in public education, support the most vulnerable, again, draw inspiration from Rawls, for example, and so on. So these theories are not simple abstract discussions. They have very practical implications for policymaking. And I think students, and I believe there will be many working professionals joining this program, will need to use these theories to guide their understanding what kind of policies they need to solve issues like poverty, gender inequality, trade deficiencies, again, the rise of algorithms, and so on and so forth. All right. Finally, on a broad term, let me say that, okay, I bring a very kind of particular perspective. I'm a foreigner working at an Indian university. But what I have tried to do is with students, while we discuss certain issues or read certain theories, we also try to discuss Indian authors. And I also draw parallels for myself. For example, if we talk about Karl Polanyi and his social embeddedness, we also can talk about Kumarappa, Ugandan economics, and try to draw parallels. So I think this may be also interesting for students. And let me conclude by sharing very briefly some experiences of my critical political economy course, which I used to teach for 3 semesters or so and may teach again in future. I structured it around in two large sections. The first one I called theory, the other one I called issues. Tavrahid called it problems, puzzles, maybe that's a better term. In terms of theory, during the very first session, again, we talked about foundations, what is political economy, how the government interacts with the economy, but also with society. And in this respect, the term political economy is again very misleading because we need to talk about politics, economics, and communities. Especially sociologists, of course, know this very well. Then we talk about different theoretical approaches. And because the course was called Critical Political Economy, we covered Frankfurt School, neo-Marxism, Foucauldian approaches, Polanyi, James Scott, infrapolitics. And I think that was it. Talking about issues or problems or puzzles, we try to apply different perspectives on problems like poverty and income inequality, gender inequality, environmental politics, then what I call neo-nationalism, a lot of people call it populism, political economy of populism, digital capitalism or algorithm governance, and also we did the political economy of the pandemic. And then we concluded, the course. In terms of teaching approach, again, it depends whether it will be an online course or offline course. I personally prefer experiential learning. So what we used to do during my course for midterm assignment, we actually tried to construct a very small on-campus gift economy where students, in a way, experimented and they interacted with each other using digital devices like WhatsApp. And whenever somebody had a need, whether material or immaterial, have a chai or have a walk, have a chat, then anybody could jump in and, meet that need. And I think it was very interesting and it was very illuminating for many students. For me, the surprising conclusion was that even in a kind of privatized, very commercialized environment where we are right now, a lot of students actually were very much excited. They could step out of this, comfort zone of being the rational Homo economicus and do something else for others and so on. I have a few other things to say, but let me stop here and pass the word to Kriti. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I think that was, you've given more ideas to think about and to incorporate both from your experience and how to set forward the course. Let me invite Professor Kosso. Can you hear us?
Yes,
Yes.
thanks, Kriti.
Hi.
Good to see you online.
It's been a long time.
Long
And
time, yeah,
yes.
been a long time. Thanks, Nayan and Ideas for calling me. And hi, Lorenza. Good to see you as well online. Hi, Shubhashish. Uh, now, uh, Rohit and Alexander have laid it out. So let me actually talk from our own experience what we did. So I've been in Ambedkar University for the last 8 years. We started the School of Global Affairs, and we in fact have an entire stream on global political economy. So let me just start with the nomenclature part of it, since some of you already referred to it. Uh, so our idea was to actually keep this. So our idea of doing global studies broadly, and I'm coming to political economy, was to essentially do two things, which sound very fancy, but one is to actually decenter it from this, Eurocentric way of understanding issues, and the second is to basically claim that it is a co-production. Now, of course, international relations and IR, we wanted to distinguish ourselves completely from. So we are not a IR. So that was very clear from the time when we started. We as in colleagues, couple of historians, political scientists, economists, etc. We were very clear as how to define this as not a IR kind of a thing alone. Of course, geopolitics and global humanities. These are the three streams: global political economy, geopolitics, and global humanities. That goes on to define what we do in the School of Global Affairs and what we do in this program called Global Studies. But the idea was to essentially say that we're not going to bind this to this idea of a nation state centric, relational kind of an idea of IR per se. So that's why we steered it into global political economy to kind of very clearly keep it away from a IPE understanding, which at that point of time, and times have changed now, 8-10 years ago, it was more squarely falling within a IR international studies kind of a frame. The second was essentially to fix the time period. So what we developed over time and steered this thing for last 7-8 years. We have 8 or 9 courses. So let me just tell you the names of them and the way we designed it and why. So we have a first semester course, which is an introduction to political economy, which then basically looks into concepts and traces this, and I'll come to that. The second one we have is a course on trade, geopolitics, and the emerging world order, which basically traces it from ancient time, the notion of trade all through, and brings in geopolitics and ends with the situation that is taking place now. Then we have a course on the political economy of labor and work, which essentially traces human civilizational, evolution through the lens of labor and work. And the fourth course that we have is actually trying to trace through particular commodities, let's say salt, gold, opium, however you want to see it, different kinds of commodities which kind of go on to become very central in the circulation and go on to make the global. So then, which depending on the choice of our commodities, we could actually, trace it from way back to now, which could then also include, the cloud world, etc., etc. And the notions of work, how that changes over time. So that's one course, and the commodities course. Then we have a course on the political economy of global institutions. Again, we kept it global institutions because if we had kept it only international institutions, it would possibly be limited to the League of Nations and the United Nations kind of a frame. But we wanted to keep it a bit broader, uh, and which also reflects with the different schools of thought that we kind of you know teach here, and a part of the curriculum, which I'm coming to next. And the last course was this was the BA program in global studies, where we have an entire stream, as I said, it's global political economy. The last one is the political economy of environment, and that's a course which deals with the interstices of political ecology and political economy. In the masters, we essentially have a course on wealth inequality, capitalist accumulation, and we have seminar courses on global political economy of development, on agrarian change, etc., etc. And as Nayan mentioned, we now have a PhD program which is getting launched this year, which then looks at this in a much more deeper way in terms of a PhD kind of thing. The time period and the spatiality of how we design the thing. The time period, essentially, we kept it more in terms of the classical political economy. So let's say the 18th, 19th century. So there are different ways to design the courses. We can take a concept and trace it back and forth. We can keep historical fidelity to a thing. We can actually, start from a contemporary situation and take it back. It depends. I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. Let's say if I'm teaching on free trade, it's possibly interesting to start with what is happening with tariffs right now and then take it back. Sometimes it could be interesting to exactly specifically start from the historical perspective. Let's say if one is possibly talking of the division of labor, and then to take it from exactly how it was being talked about and theorized at that point of time, and then bring it forward. So, but the time period, we kind of pack it in terms of, and this also brings us to the interrelated question of schools of thought. So, broadly, 5 schools of thought is what we try and cover in the courses, but it's not necessary that we have all these schools of thought in all the courses. It's definitely the classical political economies and Marx as a critique to political economy, the neoclassicals, the institutionalists, and there in between one brings in the monetarists, the Keynesians, and of course the feminists and the ecological critiques to it. Of course, depends on what kind of courses we are designing. Those schools can keep changing a bit. But the time period, essentially, we found it useful to kind of moor it in the 18th, 19th century first. And then, since we have this notion of the global south and we co-producing it, to give it a critique of colonialism, and then to flip it from the 20th century onwards into a different way of looking at political economy and global political economy. And also to remind students that political economy at one point of time, 80, 70, 80 years ago, kind of disappeared from university departments and syllabuses, and why there's a need from a global south to bring it back. So in terms of time period, I think given its global affairs, we kind of concentrated on the last 100 years a bit more, but I find it useful to trace it back from the 17th, 18th to now. And in terms of individual courses, as I said, I mean, I just gave a couple of examples, but we found it useful not to kind of look at it from a very statecraft kind of thing alone, but to actually look at it in terms of, because we're defining global as a co-production, so state and non-state, global north, global south. So to blur this has been quite an exciting and interesting journey. In terms of we've also found it useful to introduce students to different kinds of methods. Depends on the kinds of questions that one is raising. of course, given the policy world at this point of time, there's obviously a basic set of tools and methods that people would like. I mean, students definitely would possibly like to know to make sense. But in such a fast-changing world, I'm myself not sure what to stress on in terms of tools. I'd rather go a little old school on that. But I think I'll stop here and we can speak more if there are questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Kostav. That's very rich experience from a lot of years teaching the subject and having worked on designing courses on it. We'll come back to questions. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions and discussion on these. I'll invite Dr. Lorenza.
Thank you very much. I had actually prepared 2-3 slides just to guide my contribution and to help you since I'm not in the room, but I see that the screen sharing is deactivated. Could you please activate it for me? Otherwise I can't. But hello, everybody. Is audio okay anyways? Can you hear me?
टीम एबी टीम आप प्लीज इनको होस्ट राइट दे सकते हैं मैम को, डॉक्टर लोरेंजो को.
Or I should have told you before.
Try now. Lorenzo.
Now I can, okay.
Okay, we can see it.
Can you see the full screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. In terms of volume, because I hear you, I mean, the volume from the room is a bit low, but I hope you can hear me or that you don't hear me too loud. Anyways, I'll start. So first of all, thank you very much, Nayan, for inviting me to join. Good morning, good afternoon to you, colleagues in the room. Kostav I'm happy to see you even if you are on the screen. I'm happy to contribute to this very interesting discussion, and I want to do 3 things. Obviously, I don't fully know the background conversation you had before. I don't know exactly how you mean to differentiate this proposed curriculum from the program in development status. So I will share the kind of brainstorming I did on this subject and share a few maybe advice, pieces of advice, drawing on my previous experience. I need to, I mean, obviously we don't know each other, so I need to explain. I've known Nayan for a long time, I've known Costa for a long time, but I need to explain a little bit where I'm coming from to also outline what experiences shape my thoughts today. Then I made I thought of thinking of identifying myself with you design this curriculum in terms of if we need to propose a program today, given current times and given the current offers of universities around the world, how do we make this program appealing? So how do we propose it? How do we present it? And so I thought of a few elements that should be considered in this conversation. And then obviously I imagine that the plan will evolve, but I had a look at the preliminary brochure that Nayan shared with me, and I thought of giving a few, I mean, some feedback on that. at least not in terms of specific things I would change, but what I would pay attention to. So these are the 3 points I want to make. So regarding myself, okay. So I would define myself as a political economist of development. So I always took a political economy approach within development studies. So I'm in between. I've been trained in international political economy when I studied my BA and my master's in Italy. Then I've spent many years of my life at SOAS, where political economy is a grounding approach to development studies mostly. And I always worked on the Global South and in the Global South. I've been part of the international initiative for promoting political economy. That is an international research network in international political economy for over 15 years. I'm also on the council. So I've been interacting with, I've had the luck of interacting with political economists, with critical political economists coming from many countries and continents. So I also base my thoughts on this. I taught Introduction to Political Economy of Development for undergraduates and Political Economy of Development for graduates at SOAS. So in the UK, obviously we had students from around the world. You can understand that the students in the UK will come from a specific background. These would be still the elites, but or students that have the luck of accessing a scholarship, but coming from very different contexts. And I also, obviously, as Nayan was sharing, I conducted almost 20 years of research in the Global South, so 10, 12 years in India, but also in South Africa, where I also taught. In South Africa, I didn't teach political economy, but a more policy-oriented program, an MPhil in industrial policy within economics. But I also base my thoughts on that, thinking of all the feedback I collected in the years, both from critical students in the UK, but also students in South Africa that were a mix of academics and policymakers. So I'm also responding to the needs that they expressed when I taught there. So this is what informs my conclusions here. So when I think of how I would propose, and obviously, I mean, very good inputs already emerged from the three speakers that intervened before me. What I would consider, I'm just sharing my own point of view, and I hope it helps. Obviously, you can feel free to ignore my own perspective, but this is what I'm highlighting, what I would consider. First, I would consider, and you know better than me, what student composition you may attract. So not only consider where students come from. I saw when teaching master students in political economy that obviously it makes a difference if you have a background in classical economics and you have certain tools, or you come from journalism or politics. It is difficult to propose something that can easily target everyone. And so I would also consider what is your baseline. So starting point, but also what kind of students you may attract in terms of their aspirations for after the program. I've been dealing with students like policymakers that wanted to refine their research skills, some students that already know they want to continue with academia, some students that hope to get out of the program some tools to do policy analysis and work within institutions. So obviously, I'm not saying that you will find a middle ground that makes everybody happy, but you may want to consider this. And then obviously the context, which is your particular Indian context. And what the students can be exposed to outside. Another thing that I would consider, as colleagues I underlined before, is the case for IPE. I mean, it is true that political economy doesn't mean the same thing in all countries. In Italy, political economy is very, very mainstream. It's really classical political economy. In some countries, is more leaning towards politics than towards economics. And so it's often an interdisciplinary mix that I'm realizing this when applying for jobs or shifting from a country to another is not always recognized as a specific field. Is sometimes assimilated within economics, sometimes within politics, but this is something that you may want to consider. Making the case for international political economy, I would start from a discussion of how it can enrich a simple program in economics and explaining to students the value added of looking at the interaction between politics and economics. Of course, I mean, from my own perspective, this gives you the tools for a reality catch that is way beyond what classical economics can give you. And so this is something that I would highlight when proposing to students, and that you already do very well in the at least in the mission, in the vision that you outline in the what you sent me. Something to consider is what skills you can develop through a program like this. Obviously, today, the point is not just gaining the critical tools to understand global affairs, but also proper policy analysis. With a political economy background, you can understand where policy decisions come from. And this is something to sell to the students as an advantage. Applicability, again, I see that you already highlight this in the presentation to the program. How the skills you can acquire can be applied inside or outside of academia. And this is a type of awareness that I gained after years in academia, also considering that academia today can't absorb all students. And so how do we propose a program that can be helpful also for those that will not continue within academia? In terms of delivery methods, approaches, and contents, I will say this again, but I mean, at SOAS, for example, we had an entire term on term, but a first batch of lectures, all on theoretical approaches to political economy, as colleagues were highlighting before. So obviously this could be classical, this could be Marxist, this could be feminist, we also had institutional economics that could fall within neo-Keynesian approaches as well. But I mean, given an overview of theoretical approaches is important. And I would personally distinguish between theoretical approaches and applied topics. We had then all different, what we called applied topics. So either sectoral discussions or specific topics that could be, I was also thinking of the need to distinguish between agriculture, industry, etc., to explain that there are different approaches to agrarian change, different approaches or schools that analyze industrial development, taxation, finance, gender, environment. These I would consider as applied topics where you can highlight different schools of thought in political economy. And then, of course, a thing that is very appealing is the policy orientation. You also put this in the program, but explaining that this can be related to analyzing actual policies that are implemented in the world today. The other thing, finally, is what research skills you want to include. I see that you include a lot in the proposed plan, but you need to decide what you want to propose and select accordingly. In terms of Global South tailored program, well, this is part of the whole decolonizing discussion. I'm not suggesting a path, but I think a decision to be taken is, do you want only to select the sources from the Global South? That obviously is part of tailoring the program towards authors that can better speak to your students, or you want to change topics, selecting those that make sense to you. What I generally do, obviously, I'm a Global North trained scholar, but that has always adopted a Global South approach. Even here, Nayan well said, I live in Brussels. That is the core of European policies. I always go to conferences and saying, where is the Global South? How do we see this discussion from the Global South? So, for example, there is a way to still have discussions that are also included in programs in global north universities like trade or agrarian change, but selecting the perspective of India, of South Asia, of global South countries, and recentering, as the colleague before me was saying, recentering the perspective, not necessarily changing subjects, but changing the perspective. It's a decision to be taken that obviously affects the contents that you will include. And finally, obviously, I understand that this is evolving, but on the brochure you gave me, I think it's very comprehensive, and the description you outlined is already enticing. You may just want to rethink based, and I think this is what you will do today, but based on the inputs you received today. I agree with what was said before, that for a 1-year plan is very ambitious. And so if you want to include giving concepts, giving like an overview of theoretical approaches to students that might not have a background in political economy, and some policy analysis tools, and include a practical exercise or whatever you're thinking, it's a lot. You may reconsider. What I was thinking, based on what you proposed so far, I would merge some of the modules that you proposed. There is some overlapping. There is current fragmentation that could be reduced. For example, I mean, this is what I was thinking. It was having a term all on theoretical approaches, a term all on applied topics, a term on policy oriented. Would be an option. Or you could combine theory and practice on the same topic in one lecture, but probably you could merge some modules to avoid doing too much and not doing well. So you need to balance and decide the trade-off between covering a lot and depth of what you're offering. I see that you highlight, and I'll conclude here, the distinction between the academic enrichment of such a program, the research skills, and the professional value. You could well highlight this. From my experience in South Africa and in general, it is very attractive to have both, as you suggest, both academics and policy practitioners on the same topic or on different topics, but a balance of this is certainly of interest, because also gives a practical flavor of how the topics they are studying will be applied later on. And obviously something that works very well is within the same lecture. I mean, I imagine that many colleagues do this, but having a mix of theory and practical examples. And last thing, a clear outline of what are the dominant theories and the critical approaches to the same topic. This is something, for example, that I mean, criticism that we got from students enrolled in critical programs. that they also want to know, and they also want to know the mainstream. So giving an overview of both sides is very important. And this is a balance that I would also consider when defining the contents. I mean, this is a lot. I'm sure there will be a long discussion, and I really appreciate the possibility to contribute. I thank you very much. And I leave it here, but I'm happy to stay for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lorenzo. I think you've given us both an international experience and also some very practical suggestions on how one would go about framing that course and the ways to reframe the course. From now, a different standpoint, I invite Professor Rohini.
Thank you so much. Very, very rich insights and very comprehensive. I will keep this short, also because I'm a lawyer by training. I'm going to talk about this from two perspectives. First is the pedagogical aspect of it, the interaction of law and political economy. What does that mean? How does that bear on the disciplines? And then I'm going to talk from logistical and practical perspectives in terms of how do you pitch a one-year course with all of these diversities? What does that mean in terms of time? And as Dr. Lorenzo said, how do you balance the critical and the mainstream in such a time frame? So very quickly, what I teach is within something called the tradition of critical legal studies. So we engage our understanding is law has to be dealt with in all its complexities, and I also teach international law. So the critical inflection comes both by way of content and by way of pedagogical approach. What this has led to is moving away from a simplistic, technocratic, positivist understanding of law and a more embodied understanding of law as rooted in certain kinds of historical, socio-political context. So from a critical realist understanding of where law operates in relation to political economy, there actually has been a turn that we call law and political economy. So there are courses taught on this. Now, this is done very differently. The American tradition is different. The European tradition of this is different. And there are some conversations, in the global South as well about how to then introduce this idea of law. To put it very simply, the idea is clear. We understand law, particularly international law, as a tool that both constructs and sustains capital. That's the perspective we come from, for which we do two sets of things. One is a history of financialization and how the juridification of certain concepts happen in law. So we go back to the international financial institutions, how development emerges as a ruling rationality in international law. I particularly teach international law, and our argument is that it is the specific form of international law that facilitates capital and reduces a certain kind of social and economic reproduction that way. So to do this, what we need to do is go back to the history of the financial institutions and understand international law as something that operates between two tensions. So it exhibits a certain kind of critical instability and works between what we call the political and the post-colonial quality. And then the underlying ruling rationality is development. So this is how we introduce it. Then we move on to the idea of what is law and political economy and how this turn to LP emerges. So not so much questions of rules, regulations, and enforcement only, but how power is operating through rules, regulations, and enforcement. In that sense, dealing with this from a global South perspective is both a methodological and a pedagogical question. So as Dr. Lorenza said, not just picking authors from the global South, but also, I think the two of you speak about this, take on the epistemological puzzle, question the given norms and terms, and understand what these terms may historically mean, or were there other contesting terms during the time of institutionalization of some of these debates. So I think then, having heard all of you and all of you have experienced teaching political economy course, for us it's mostly recognizing how law entwines with all of this. So one question then is, how much of law do you want in this? In what capacity? If you're talking about law's institutional powers, I do think a certain kind of history of financial institutions and the emergence of development as an entwined concept has to be reckoned with. The other aspect is when we are looking at, this sort of mediating role that law plays in balancing democratic institutions, power, and so on and so forth. The third way that I was thinking, when you said if you club them into different epistemological clusters, which then also speak to the method. So I also work within queer feminist approaches. And for us, then, in critical legal studies, working through that lens simply means posing questions of gender, labor, but not necessarily just in those terms. Which is going back to what you said, problematizing the origin. So the way I am thinking, maybe three areas where law can interact with the course that you're proposing, and introducing certain global South history and debates, the way the power asymmetries operate through law, and how law mediates these other relationships. Um, Now I come to the practical bit. It is a 1 year course, from what I understand. So this is a lot to do, and I guess we have to spend a considerable amount of time in the planning and the framing, uh, or perhaps decide what is a priority to achieve here, because we will lose out some things in the process. With any kind of critical inflection, and I think if you're teaching anything from the Global South or with the Global South in mind, that has to be a critical inflection. I see no other way. So with any kind of critical inflection, the general challenge, as Dr. Lorenza say, has been the mainstream approaches have to be introduced. We do it slightly differently in critical legal studies, whereby we do them together. So we are also making an ontological claim for the discipline. So our problem, or rather our proposition, is not so much that there are other ways of critiquing a mainstream. Our proposition in international law is, at least, this is the way you should be looking at international law. So there could be a way to think about combining the mainstream and the critical, however you call it, in a way that's more integrated. That may not be possible in all the modules and terms that we've envisioned. So we might want to maybe prioritize this in the conceptual and foundational weeks, and maybe come back to it in the end again. And then the two, terms that you envisioned in between could focus more on the other ideas. But that's sort of what I was thinking. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rohini. So you've set for us that's interesting insights from the legal and how political, for people who are used to teaching political economy, how it intertwines with the legal framework and critical studies from the legal standpoints. Okay, so now we have time for discussion. We have almost 45 minutes left for discussion. I'll come in, but before that, I thought what we could do now is first let's open the questions to the audience. So those who are listening, and for people who are running the course, if there's some particular question that they would like the discussants to reflect upon, let's throw open a few questions, and then we can have more discussions on these topics that have come in. I think broadly we have seen three main areas in which the topics have been framed around. One is, what is a perspective of the global South? What does it mean? How will it be reflected in the course? Second is this, it has come across the different presenters on how you pick up ideas, problems, or issues versus theories, epistemological approaches, and how do you take these forward. So the debate and contrast between the two. And third is practically, how do you prioritize? What do you bring in a 1 year course? How do you select some, leave out others? What do you do? So these are, I find, the broad themes of discussion. Let's open if there are any questions anyone would like to pose on how this would go ahead, or anyone would like to ask. If there's anything from the post discussants to ask. Okay. Anyone else? Do you want to reflect on? Okay. Okay. So then I would say, let's go on this question of first, say, the perspective from the global South. There's a good discussion I felt on how it means in terms of both. There were two elements I thought that had come to the discussion on the global South. One, the fact that yes, it means resetting it from in terms of books and authors from the global South, and the second on perspectives from the global South and issues from the global South, that we are taking this forward. So one suggestion I would say, and others may also reflect, is this something then you want to bring up front in your program? So what you have currently is, you are really thinking that the question on Asia and India comes in your final module almost. Would that be something that you would start with? And if you start with it, how would you reframe it? Would be one thing that I would, even from the discussants, is if you want to pitch Global South from the first, how would you suggest, how would you think that that could be done? The second is, I think, a point that was brought out by the discussants, but maybe a bit more reflection on the question of, yes, you are expecting students from very different profiles, you're expecting students from different disciplinary backgrounds and different perspectives. Would you need a foundation course? What would be foundations on it? Because we go directly, the current program goes directly into international political economy, which directly says, look, assume certain knowledge out there. Would that be something that you can assume, or would you want an introductory history of economic thought or theories? What form of foundational course requirements would be there, given the constraint of a 1 year program? Right? So it is a challenge to have both, but how would we have that? So maybe I'll ask the discussants if anyone wants to start, or you can go by the order that you went in. Alexander?
I mean, just a couple of ideas. So
Mm.
regarding how to highlight, for example, the local context, whether you're based in India or in any other country, what we did with students is when we picked up, so I mentioned that we had our course structured in two parts. The first one was mostly theoretical and mostly critical approaches. Gramsci, Marx, Polanyi, Foucault, James Scott, and so on. The other one was already applying these perspectives, but not only this, in fact, contrasting them with more mainstream approaches, like neoclassical economics. And every time we actually, first of all, like, okay, I really like to make PPTs, right? So I usually highlighted some Indian examples. When we talk about poverty and inequality, right? While we can draw on some, well-known databases like World Bank reports or Piketty's and his team World Inequality Database, Income Inequality Database, Wealth Inequality. You can always like highlight the Indian case, for example, or you can draw even more specific illustrations, talk about the, ultra wealth in India, Mambanis, and so on and so forth. So there are always ways to highlight, to illustrate what you're discussing. For example, when we talked about gender inequality, Rahini very interestingly mentioned feminist political economy, right? We actually read some work by Tithi Bhattacharya about, invisible household labor, social reproduction theory, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I don't think that it's that hard. You can always find some examples, illustrations of voices which really, in a way, bring forward your point. When it comes to more foundational part of any IPE course, again, I was kind of trained, I don't know how to put it, but yeah, probably in a more Western canon, even though based in Singapore, but we read, like Western-centric classics and so on, and only later I developed my interest in critical political economy. So again, you can try to find parallels, right? For example, I mentioned one case when you do modern liberal political economy perspectives. Let's say you read some post-Keynesian or authors, then you can, in a way, complement with Gandhian economics, although that is debatable. But you can really find parallels. So that is my point. In terms of how to squeeze all this into the 1 year program, yes, I think that's a challenge. But I definitely will not sacrifice the theory part. Again, if all of these guys who join the program, they are aspiring policymakers, I think they must be exposed to theory and to different theories because these will guide them. I mean, if you are Sanyal, if you are an economist, I don't know, to the current regime, yes, you can be based in this kind of neoclassical tradition. You can promote growth and competitive market and so on and so forth. But it's only one approach. And it's value laden, like I said in the beginning. It's not objective, it's not neutral. It's a very specific approach in a way, very specific tradition. So if you are exposed to different theoretical traditions, then you are more flexible. You have more degrees of freedom, sorry to use a positivist term. But definitely, like in the first part of the course, if it's one term or maybe three sessions of the first term, different traditions, different approaches. Oh, and finally, let me conclude in a way a bit off the topic, but in our library, and for those who are online, you can consult the book online. I actually ordered 2 years ago. We have the book called Handbook to Alternative Approaches in Political Economy. There are more than 30 chapters, right? So it's very diverse. It's immensely diverse. It was edited by University of Sydney political economists, so I highly recommend it.
Thank you. And I think that is one clear. I think most of the panelists agreed that more on theory and different theoretical approaches. But let me put a slightly more incendiary question to the economists and the non-economists to chip in the role of maths and econometrics. Right? That currently, with so much space, we are not touching on it. Do you think a course in IPE will fly without actually introducing students to the tools and the strategies that contemporary economics bases a lot of its work on? Yes, Rohit?
Yeah, this is something I grapple with quite often, which is in our BA Political Science program, we have one course which is Principles of Economics. And when you compare that course with the rest of the coursework that they have, students generally, quite frankly, hate the subject. So it is filled with graphs and I think the very paradigm in which an average BA economics students in India learns this subject, as opposed to how a BA political science students learns it, makes it very challenging. So I've been trying to develop approaches to teach this. One way in which I've managed to do it, and I do use it in my other subjects I teach as well, is to teach the intuition behind the math rather than start with equations. Because as a student myself, I suffered with this. It's not, uh, I do believe that I'm quite good at grabbing the intuition, but the language of mathematics is what I struggle with. So I think I've used that, the fact that I was a terrible math student in designing the courses that I've had. And for instance, I think the classes that I had this week, I think even though this wasn't prescribed in the syllabus, I did teach them the national income identity. And using the national income identity, I was trying to explain how economists of certain eras have always come up with theories that are uh, supposed to be a product of the challenges of their times. That is, if you have uh, uh, Karl Marx, he's trying to solve a problem during the Industrial Revolution. If you have John Maynard Keynes, he's trying to solve a problem of his era, which is the Great Recession. If you have Friedrich Hayek, he's coming from a place of the problems of completely controlled, centralized, planned economies, right? Which means that you can talk about the uh, politics of economic paradigms. And I think that's what an IPE course should also focus on. And if you do that, and I think what all panelists have said here, you can kind of solve that problem, which is of how to incorporate the critical and the mainstream. So if you focus on that idea, so I think the reading that I've used in class was by the Canadian political economist Peter Hall. I mean, it's quite an old reading, but it's a good survey of how Keynesian demand management became like the dominant way in which economics seems to be practiced in the policy in almost every country. How that idea is something we don't even question because it just seems so self-evident that this is the way you manage the economy. And then you can talk about how what is self-evident about how you manage the economy has changed when the economic order has changed, going back to the 19th century. So in that way, I would also like to touch on what I realized after I talked and listening to Kaustubh especially, that because my courses are about contemporary political economy, I didn't even go beyond I would say the inter-warriors, nothing before the inter-warriors. I didn't even consider it in my syllabus. But it is something I had thought of introducing in the coursework as well. But I think that again is a challenge that you will face when it's a 1 year MSc in IPE course. That anytime you try and go beyond a certain time period, it is actually hard to communicate to the students why this is relevant. And in our own department, you can ask our medieval historians, and we have two medieval historians, at least one medieval historian in our department, who has been tasked with teaching the Indian Ocean. So the way our international affairs students think of the Indian Ocean and how a medieval historian thinks of Indian Ocean. So as an academic dean, I often get complaints about that class, but I have to explain to the students that there is a lot of value in trying to understand what the Indian Ocean is from the medieval times. So from when we orient these 1 year programs as very commercial programs, that is something that you will struggle with. And I think that's what I was trying to explain as the last point during my intervention, which is that you will have to do something about the kind of students that you reach out. That will always be a challenge. And regarding the maths and econometrics bit, I think that will always be a challenge, especially in India, where there is a hierarchy of social sciences, right? Those who don't get into engineering do economics, those who don't get into economics do political science, those who don't get into political science do sociology and humanities. That's how we imagine how subjects work here in India, which means that it is very hard to convince a student in the humanities that you can also learn math and it's actually valuable. You can, and that requires a different kind of pedagogy. For economics, teaching economics to pol science students, I've used the core textbook. And I found that that textbook is actually very good in explaining heterodox economics theories without math. But they do use the intuition behind the math. So there are tools out there, I think, which you can use to design the syllabus. These are the interventions I have.
Sorry, I'll be very quick because I am the non-economics person speaking. I actually wanted to say what you were saying, but convey it through the paradigms of my discipline where similar challenges arise. First is I was looking at who you're marketing this course to, and that brings us to the question of when such a wide variety of students with different undergraduate degrees are coming to do a course like this, how much of technical density do they want? I mean, it's both good and bad. On one hand, some of them might say that I've joined this course hoping to learn some of that math. And the others would say we are not equally equipped to do it. Those with an economics background might fare better. So that's, I think, one thing we need to figure out. The second is that we keep coming back to this introducing a critical inflection and a paradigm and how to make that seem relevant. It is a huge challenge. I'll give you two examples from my discipline. Maybe there are, parallels there. One is the presumption is law is fundamentally a doctrinal positivist subject. This is not true because there are so many of us doing what we are doing. Then the question is, how do you get past two basic misinformation? One is critique is theory and doctrine is somehow the only positivist way to do it. What we do is we are introducing the notion of critique with one or two doctrinal examples just to make a point. Some of these doctrines are self-evident, but we also say that you have to foreground this introduction with certain concepts. And I'm wondering if there's a way to make a similar accommodation when you're doing, like you say, the intuition behind the math. So what we do is the context and the intuition behind the doctrine and then introduce the doctrine. You don't have to do it with all of them, but one or two heavily read ones usually work for us. The second thing is, and this is a bit of a, I don't know what to call it. So what we do is because there is this perpetual, misunderstanding, a lot of students come to us saying, we want to practice in the UN. That's what we think international law does. Why are you not teaching us X, Y, Z? And what we say is we are teaching you that, but we are also telling you why just learning that will not work for you. So our foundational conceptual claim then is, let's take the example of India. And I say, if you're a student learning international law in India in this time and day, you need to know why it will not work the same way for you as it may for somebody from the global north. It's a very simplistic way of putting it. But what we do is within the course, we introduce the significance of why they need to do that long arc of, disciplinary complexity. So just sort of make it clear in the mandate. And I'm thinking don't just leave it to the outreach. The course might want to make it self-evident that we think this perspective is important because of who you are and because of where you are. And I think that also tends to, unfortunate problem of a course, that also tends to the marketability issues that will arise. So perhaps something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Nayan, you want to say? Yeah, okay. Professor Costa or Lorenzo, if you want to, yeah, Costa, please.
Okay. No, thanks. Thank you. Uh, I'll be very brief on this one. I think uh, the two things that one needs to think, I mean, this is also speaking to what all my colleagues just before me have spoken. Think of the perspective that you want to actually pitch it as. And that's, something that will hold through and reflect through in the courses as well as the timeline. Okay. Let me give again the how for the last 7 8 years we evolved this. So the debate was that if we want to say that the global is basically co-produced, the time frame when we want to decenter it in a certain sense would be colonialism and then this decolonizing, or post-colonial movement, however you want to define it. So in a certain sense, that if we want to constantly give a different way of looking at uh, colonialism, let's say, for example, then it's not just colonization of land, but it's through the oceans and the rivers and the frontiers that this can happen. So the movement of commodities across those frontiers, so let's say through the seas and through the rivers and through the frontiers, what is the kind of movement of commodities, people, the systems that get set up that we start highlighting more than necessarily what a historical perspective of a landlocked, land-based system would be. So those things, kind of start evolving once you fix what the perspective is. And I completely leave it. I mean, it's a fascinating thing, and one can, leave it to colleagues that ideas to think where you want to pitch it as, and that pitch will then actually help in 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 uh, in bringing down the time space question, which is what is the time period that you want to focus on will then get decided on this pitch. So let's say if the pitch is from the global south in this kind of perspective in the last 100 years, was even more is interesting, but the last 100 years would have way more significant situations for us to play out than, let's say, the 17th, 18th century per se, in that sense. And the spatiality of that would also mean that if we want to make it, uh, forward Asia and backward Europe kind of a frame, then we can frame it in that sense. Or depending on how we want to move it. So in a certain sense, I think that pitch clarity has to emerge from all of you at gender. The second thing, the last thing about the mathematics part, or the tools part, I would say no, avoid it. I mean, don't make it into a pitch, because very this might sound a bit rude, but those who want to do economics and can qualify to do economics will not come for your course. They will go to an economics department to do an economics course. And those who will come to your course, hence, in a master's program, would have possibly dealt with this fear last in their school, right? The fear of mathematics. And I personally feel, I can say this. I was the only economist in my department. So I had to fight this from a different perspective, which was, of course, everyone said that, people want to learn tools and people want to learn this. And so we had to keep it open for the first few years. And of course, the experience of teaching it was that, the students who came for a master's program in global studies, didn't do well in mathematics in the unfortunate way that it's taught in our Indian school college system. very well. And so the last time they'd done it was in class 11 or 12. So that kind of foundational thing I wouldn't push for. Anyway, in today's day and age, just to make sense of the numbers, and I think what Rohit was saying, I completely agree. Teach the intuition behind it, but it's best not to, and it's not even required to get into the nitty-gritties of that at this point of time. If after a 1-year MA, someone wants to do a further PhD, in all possibility, she or he will possibly go to a department who will then teach it in much greater detail. I don't think in a 1-year program would be able to do too much in terms of a broad range of tools. It's better to actually teach them different methods in a very hands-on way if possible. But that again depends on the design. But not to get too much bogged down into the specific tools and sellability. And the last thing is, of course, I tell my students all the time that the point of teaching you political economy is for you to understand that, skills and this and that. I mean, that's not something we teach. That's something that happens in a space outside us. And you need to, keep matching to it. It's not like we are providing, we're not matching supply and demand. So that's fundamental to political economy. We can't do it. So yeah, it's better to be clear what we can't do.
Okay.
Good to have that idea. Dr. Lorenzo, and
Yeah.
also taking up this discussion and also adding on from your experience from different places of teaching on what are the skills then students do want to learn. I do agree that mathematics is unlikely to be something they're looking forward to, but what would be these type of skills that people you think people would be looking forward to in a course like this?
Okay, I'll speak to the first two questions you raised and this, merging them. So one is on the Global South perspective, as I was saying. My view here is that you need to combine a reselection of sources and the change in topics, because changing the selection of sources can be just cosmetic adjustment. You can have scholars from the Global South that are completely embedded in a mainstream view and that play along dominant institutions. And that is not enough. Also, how do you, a practical issue is, how do you recognize in a globalized world a scholar from China that studied in the US or in China, or as well an Indian or an African that was trained in different contexts? So the selection of sources is a limited tool. One further adjustment can certainly be mixing all the new sources, because pluralism within political economy has certainly increased over time, and there are many different approaches. I'm thinking of gender studies, for example, that can complement mainstream views from before. And the other thing is on topics. I think that the reality check to ensure that there is a Global South view is a development perspective, is always putting within a global debate, okay, as a Global South countries, how do we participate in this global process? As actors, as recipients of foreign policy, and how can we claim local benefits? I mean, adopting a different view to me means translating the global debate into what can be a local development benefit, and what can be self-criticism in terms of historical participation of a country within global policies that have perpetuated domination and uneven participation. So a development perspective, I think, can be the counter adjustment to only having a mainstream debate that only reflects a global North view. Foundations, I agree with Kostav. So I think you have two options. I think probably offering or demanding a foundational course like a pre-course is too much. I don't think students would have the time or accept to do a course as a prerequisite to a master. The tools you have could be either you select only students that come from a certain background, saying like students from economics, from politics, and from law, not from any kind of subject, depending on the perspective you want to embody. Or you say, for example, those that don't have a background, there are like, I don't know, 5 core texts that are required before you enter. Otherwise, you can't enroll in these courses. I mean, some criteria of 2, 3 readings that are suggested as a background. Otherwise, you can't follow. Because if you accept anybody from any background, that also means you need to lower the level of what you're delivering to let everybody follow. So it's complicated, but you could put some criteria. Finally, on econometrics, well, obviously, and skills. Obviously, those that have a BA in economics would have done some econometrics and will have some tools to understand a policy paper that uses an econometrics model. Yes, but I agree that you can't put everything in a 1-year program, and probably obviously you need to select what you include, but that probably the skills the students enrolling in a course like this would be most attracted to would be policy analysis, or I mean, the possibility to comment on global affairs. It could also be a career in journalism, not necessarily in academia, but it's more about analytical tools than technical tools that I think would be searched for in this kind of program from my point. So I would highlight the skills in policy analysis, for example.
Thank you. I think that's very important to know. Okay, so I think we are winding to a close. So one final round of discussion and we'll close it. So I thought one final this that we could take up. Of course, you are all welcome to put your own final line. But one thing I thought would be interesting is how much do we also bring in? So we've talked of the mainstream on the alternative side, gender, environment. These are things that I don't see emphasized in the course till now. So how much space do topics like this take and how do we bring it? We'll start with Rohini because I do think she has to leave. So we'll start that and we will go. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, discipline specific for me, and we'll figure out what's transferable. This is actually relatively easy for me in the sense that, again, in the way we deal with law through critical traditions, we think of it more of a pedagogical approach. So one simple way to do it is the illustrations, examples, and case studies are around these issues. The other is for us, there are some methodological interventions that we make. So for instance, when we're talking about a feminist approach to some of these subjects, what we do is we focus on relational understanding of things. And I think that's true of all disciplines, but we are particularly interested in establishing the relational understanding of concept, by which I mean it doesn't just have to be these as subjects, but these also as lenses and methods that you take. That kind of takes care of the gender question. Automatically, when you take on that methodology, you also explain where it's coming from. So your examples will invariably include those. I'll give you an example, again from law. So for instance, when we teach something like sovereignty, we talk about it as a process. And the minute we start talking about it as a process, its gendered manifestations or imperial ones become quite obvious to us. I don't know if something like that is possible in this course. I guess summarily what I'm saying is taking a more relational approach than a definitional one, and wherever possible, bringing these concepts into the example or the case studies. So you have the framework as well as you have the illustrative conversations around labor, gender, and so on and so forth. And I think you were talking about a specific module or a cluster. That's also another way of doing it. Uh, Thank you so much. I will have to take your leave. I've been summoned by the law school, but thank you so much. This was very, very illuminating.
Okay. Great.
Okay, so just, in order to build up on Rahini's points also, let me take the example of AI. AI, everybody's talking about it. But so one way, for example, well, first of all, I think the curriculum definitely will benefit from, in trendy topics, right? Like the rise of AI, algorithmic governance, how they affect society, individuals, politics, and so on. But then if you introduce this topic in the curriculum, again, you need to frame it. You need to be very clear as a lecturer, or as an instructor, that there are, again, many approaches, but actually you can make it easier for students by saying that, broadly speaking, there are two very fundamental approaches to how we understand algorithmic governance, right? The first one is what some scholars call techno-functionalist approach, which is the mainstream, which is proposed by governments, by tech companies, by entrepreneurs, essentially treating algorithms as nothing but lines of code, pre-programmed, optimized for efficiency, quite often for profit as well, and which is used in many, many systems, as we know. Now, the other approach, and you can emphasize this in the curriculum, is what some call social political approach, socially embedded approach. And that is a more critical one, where Rahini used the term relational. Actually, I think it's more relational because it says algorithms, like any technology, is not neutral. It's really related to society, to power structures, to the state, to the political economy of capitalism. It cannot be neutral by definition, right? Yeah, it has, of course, biases. It has many, many other things. And from that perspective, also, you will have, again, different policy implications. If you want to understand how AI can, for example, solve the problem of poverty, if you are taking a social embedded perspective, you would say, well, actually, AI, they reinforce, for example, gaps between, I don't know, different castes in India. And there is research on that as well, right? So simply regulating AI, simply proposing a law on making it transparent will not be enough, which is what techno-functionalists would say. Okay, yes, we know there are issues. Let's make AI transparent. But again, from a more relational, more sociological perspective, that is not enough. So I think you can really, as you go along through the syllabus, if you discuss these important political economic topics, you can, in a way, contrast, compare, and again, challenge students to come up with different policies dependent on these different approaches.
Thank you. I'm going to request Dr. Lorenza next. So we go back and we end with Rohit this time. So if Dr. Lorenza would like to, if you'd like to.
So on a selection of topics, mainly, yes, I think I see 4 or 5 core topics that you should include if you want to attract students. Certainly, there is digitalization, technological change. I don't know if you wanna, can you hear me? Or I froze?
Maybe just repeat.
Sorry, can you hear me? I think I froze a minute. So digitalization, technology, something students want to understand. I think I'm having connection problems. Gender, environment, trade for sure. Trade and the global order is something that I think I liked the focus on institutions that the proposed brochure had. I would relate it to institutions and global politics, because I think understanding how, for example, the G20 system works, or this world summit function. We can say we can see the limits, but understanding the political economy behind those, I think, is something very important for students that want to understand the world today.
Thank you. Professor Costa?
Yeah, I just think that the two ways we do it, and I think the different. This is answering Kriti the point you raised about different focus areas uh, which can be got in. So one way to do it is to essentially use a concept, and I mean this is how we start. We basically say there are different schools of thought in political economy. It basically means that there can be the same occurrence of the same event or the phenomena which will have very different kinds of standpoints, and that's absolutely fine. I think that's the way to start off the situation, which basically gives us the leeway to then veer into different, and not each concept has to have different schools of thought in it. So what we would do is we would use in the beginning an example, let's say markets, and then bring in how the institutionalists look at the phenomenon of the market, how the classicals, the neoclassicals look at it, how the Marxists look at it, etc., etc. Not each would have to have all schools of thought in it, because that can get boring. And in different ways, let's say when one is looking at labor and work, then bring in the feminist perspective. Sometimes when we're looking at the notion of value, bring in the environmental, ecological perspective. So in a certain sense, each, or let's say when we're doing money, we bring in the monetarists and the Keynesians. So it depends on the concepts. We can do different schools of thought to explain each concept. That I think is a good idea to kind of, get students interested in different points of views. And also it gives us a leeway while we teach that concept to historically trace it back and forth how we want it. So yeah, if I'm doing, let's say on the example of money, I want to bring the monetarists, I would actually then focus on the Mont Pelerin Society to 1973, the coup, etc., etc. If I want to, focus on a different notion, then I'd bring in Bretton Woods, and if I want to look at the, cryptocurrency, I would bring it now. I mean, but this would actually give us contemporary as well as historical, and also try and deal different schools of thought. So that's one way of doing it. The older way of doing it was historically to trace it, but that I find to be a little problematic, because it becomes too Eurocentric in certain ways, because that's how classical through concepts and take it back and forth across to bring in issues of the global south. And I completely agree with Lorenzo that it doesn't have to be authors from the global south, because that wouldn't help. The last thing was in terms of the topics and narrowing of the topics. I think if you make it policy focus, and if you make it in a problem solving kind of a thing, then you really have to have a very interesting mix of, and colleagues before me have already said it, of foundational issues as well as contemporary challenges. For example, if you're pitching it in this year, to focus it too much on a rule-based order is not going to cut much ice. That's a joke at this point of time. So, in that sense, I think the history of financial institutions, the Bretton Woods, this and that, we are possibly in a situation of flux. And given that you're pitching it now, I would rather keep it open. So that's what I meant in the sense that if we know what our focus is in that kind of a way, our perspective is when you're pitching it, I think it's best not to get too tied down by the older frameworks, but to kind of keep a evolving, emerging kind of framework. And I really think bringing down the number of topics would really help. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Costa. Dr. Rohit, please.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with what everyone's been talking about. Specifically related to maybe two topics, like say something like gender or environment. I would say in my own courses, the way I've thought about it was okay, I've been teaching political economy or specifically political economy of development, if should environment be a module within that course or should I replace the economy with ecology? Because I think those are the two different ways of thinking about it. If you replace it with ecology, of course, the subject kind of changes quite a lot. But that move, the distance between how you center the economy as opposed to how you center the ecology will tell you whether this should be a separate stream or whether this is just one more topic within that discipline. I think if you remember that, I think the curriculum design will become self-evident. Otherwise, we will always be caught in this flux of balancing different approaches because depending on what problem we try to solve, our epistemics will obviously change. I think that's there.
Thank you to all panelists. And in fact, one of the ways I have handled it when I've had a constraint of time is to teach the concepts and allow assignments and allow assessments as a way where students pick up their issues and explore more on that. So that's another possibility for you to consider. I'd like to thank all of the panelists here, and I hand it back to Professor Naranjati and thank him for organizing the session.
Thank you, everyone. The focus on theory rather than on the maths bit got me a bit concerned because, like, I'm an social anthropologist and I have been teaching political economy course. So right now we want more economists in ideas. We have a lot of other sociologists and so on. But it was a great session. It gave us a lot of ideas also how to go about framing it in a more open-ended manner, but also in a more sure manner, instead of trying to mix too many things, instead of make a good avial, not a bad avial. Thank you, Kostov. It would have been good to have you here physically, but thank you for your inputs. And
Thanks.
we'll, as we go ahead with all the panelists also, we will keep in touch. And as we develop it, maybe we can have more dialogue around it. Thank you, Lorenza, for making time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
My
we'll
pleasure.
be yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank you, Professor Alexander. It was great to have you. So first time actually I'm hearing you here, but it was really good. Thank you, Rohit, for being there from since we were kind of putting it together. And thank you, Preeti, for doing this. I was like a bit unsure because there were too many economists, so I thought I'll hit you, but thank you.